Welcome to Nerds at Church, a podcast about nerdery and the Bible. I'm Pastor Emily, and I use pronouns like they, them, theirs.
And I'm Pastor Kay, and my pronouns are she, her. In this episode, we'll discuss the readings for Christmas Eve, which this year falls on December 24th, like it usually falls.
What a surprise! Since we're not using a blog anymore, check out the episode description for links to the Bible passages and other references we make in this episode. For our deep dive for this episode, we're talking about chosen one narratives. So in our gospel reading for today in particular, we get some of the key pieces of Jesus' narrative that portray him as a chosen one, right? We get a special, difficult circumstance around his birth, that they have to go away from their home for the census, and then also some special, key indication that he is special even as a child, which is the angels who announce his birth to the shepherds who then come and tell about his birth. That Jesus as the chosen one is, for Christians, particularly relevant, but Jesus is not the only chosen one, even in the Bible, right? So we get Moses is one of the key chosen ones too. His birth is particularly special. It comes under difficult circumstances where literally Pharaoh is trying to kill all of the baby boys. And there's a special gift or special thing that happens for him, which is that because of his sister Miriam, he safely makes it so that he actually ends up being raised by Pharaoh's daughter. So this is a trope, if you will. And it happens in the Bible. It happens for a lot of our faith traditions, but it also happens a lot in fiction, especially young adult fiction, but fiction broadly. So Harry Potter is probably the most obvious one for listeners of our podcast, especially historically, where he's identified as a baby, born during a war, and then there's a particular, there's a prophecy about him, and there's a celebration that happens when he's little because he presumably defeats Voldemort. Also, historically, the history around Roman emperors was that they were chosen ones. So when we read in the Bible that Jesus was the Son of God, that's actually a term that was also used about Caesar. So it was a challenge to Caesar. And when we think about Caesar's, the narratives for Caesar's birth, the way that Caesar is portrayed in that time is that Caesar also is a chosen one.
Which is part of why Caesar wanted to kill Jesus.
Right. Part of why Caesar was not a fan of Jesus, part of why the empire was not a fan of Jesus, because he challenged this narrative. And the way that Caesar's chosen one narrative was enacted was to oppress and to rule everybody else, versus the chosen one narratives of Jesus and Moses, which are to resist the oppressive forces. Also, so I haven't finished the second season as of this recording, but I'm quite sure I will have by the time this actually goes out. But The Mandalorian, right? We look at The Mandalorian and the story of Baby Yoda, who has a name, but I don't know it yet, and I'm trying not to spoil it for myself by finding out the name yet. But Baby Yoda, right, is this chosen one. There's a lot of controversy around Baby Yoda as far as originally the Mandalorian is sent to kill him, but there's a lot of controversy there. Baby Yoda is definitely has the Force, and so there's that as a marker of specialness.
Or from an earlier installment in the Star Wars franchise, of course, there's Anakin, who was the one called to balance the Force, the chosen one of the Jedi, and was actually born from the Force and his mom, Shmi. They never entirely explain how that worked.
Oh, and that also Rey and Kylo Ren / Ben also are chosen ones in that sense of balancing the Force. There's also that foretold, yeah.
Or if we'd like to switch fandoms for a moment, there's Aang from Avatar: The Last Airbender, who was one of the line of avatars sent to balance the the various bending elements. And if we would like to bring up a female chosen one or special birth for a change, of course, there's Sleeping Beauty, who was long awaited by her parents, and once she was born, they invited everyone in the kingdom to bring her gifts, including not quite all of the fairies, and that did not go terribly well for them. She still did certainly have a special birth, and she was chosen to, freeze time for her castle and people for a while. Not really something she would have chosen for herself, probably, but it worked out okay in the end, mostly. So.
Well, and Triss from the Divergent series by Veronica Roth is a chosen one, and less so in the birth sense, and more so it comes out in her teenage times when she is marked as divergent, and she's a particularly divergent. So she is marked as a chosen one. And also Binti from the book Binti by Nnedi Okorafor is also a chosen one. There are a lot.
And to reference our previous episode, of course, Buffy from Buffy the Vampire Slayer is an obvious example.
Yep, Buffy is a chosen one as well. So there are a lot of different chosen ones. It's definitely a trope in fiction, and especially if we're looking at young adult dystopias, which I love. There's a great thing on Goodreads that is Veronica Roth has a new book called The Chosen Ones that goes with starting right after most of the other chosen one books or have ended. So it's like, now you've done this traumatic thing and you have all of this unwanted fame. What is life?
Go forth and make terrible life choices.
Right? That sounds like a really cool book and I'm interested in it. But then part of the interview with her, she names a whole bunch of different chosen one narratives. So if you're interested in some of those, you can check out some books with chosen one narratives there. Also, a lot of my interest in this came from a Witch Please episode, which they're doing a reboot as well. And so their first episode is actually around chosen one tropes and how book one fits in that.
And I would point out that in terms of talking about chosen one narratives in the church context, I have found it useful to bring this kind of thing up with both children and adults, but especially adolescents, while you are talking about faith. Bring up these tropes, bring up these fictional characters, bring up the historical characters, because that way you can compare and contrast with Jesus and talk about how Jesus is being a chosen one, or Moses being a chosen one. There's a lot of differences, and you can talk about the importance of how Jesus being a chosen one is different because Jesus did not come to lead an army. Jesus did not come to have great riches and power and control people. Jesus' style of being a chosen one is countercultural in many ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I always think you can use the things that we read to compare to the Bible and get something out of it. It's like that's the entire premise of our podcast.
Yay! Because we're just that genius.
Or cheesy.
And humble.
Both. All.
Our first reading for this episode is from Isaiah chapter 9, verses 2 through 7. Isaiah prophesies that the people of God, who have experienced much misery, will be brought by God into a time of great joy and peace by a special child born among them.
So one of the themes for this passage is the end of war. So specifically thinking about all the boots of the tramping warriors and the garments rolled in blood shall be burned as fuel for the fire. The ways that we're marking the end of violence, the end of war. And I was thinking about it, and I know in Firefly, the brown coats still wear brown coats. So there's a sense of the war and the resistance not yet being over. But I was also thinking about the ways that we mark the end, or the ways that we welcome people back from war. And we, in this country, do it absolutely horridly. We spend all of this time getting people ready to go to war, and then 24 hours and they could be back. I don't know which tribe this is, but I remember reading at some point that there were part of kind of rituals around warriors returning home in native tribes was like to be greeted outside of where they were living, outside of the town or whatever, and to be stripped of their clothing, stripped of what they were wearing in battle, and washed and given new clothing as a sign of stripping away, because there is a lot of moral injury that happens in a war. There's a lot of violence that happens, and it's complicated because people have different ideas about what is justified and what is not justified, and protecting their communities. But we need to figure out ways.
And you're not always making rational decisions at that point.
Right, and that's part of like how the military is set up. That's part of how groups that fight are set up. But there needs to be
militaries having uniforms is one of the oldest ways you can tell someone's in the military in history. And part of that is because you don't want to wear the garments you wore to war back home. And even today, in so many other contexts, many people will know that if you wear an outfit during a traumatic event, you never want to wear that again. Or if you wear it during a particularly wonderful event, you only want to wear that for special occasions afterwards. Our clothing and the way that we treat it winds up being tied up in our emotions so easily.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's something that we as a culture in the United States need to do better at and need to work on, is to figure out what do we want to mark the end of violence, the end of war. And partly we're like stuck in a cycle of unending war, which is its own super problematic thing. But that's part of what Isaiah is calling us to, right? Do we burn all of the clothes that are coated in blood, all of the clothes that were used in the war, the boots that were trampling, or do we do something else? And it's less important what we do and more important, I think, that we do something, that there is a way. That's what ritual is for, is to make meaning and hold space for things that are too complex for simple words.
I don't know that I would phrase it quite that way, because I think what we do is important. And also I think that you and I, not being veterans, are probably not the ones to, determine what that is. The importance of ritual and of allowing the people who have that experience to create that ritual in conversation with others, certainly. But
I mean, I wasn't saying like you and I create the thing.
No. But I was trying to emphasize the importance of one of the important aspects of that ritual would need to be the agency of the people who have gone through the experience. It needs to be not only for them, but by them.
Well, and I think it's not just I think for sure they need to be involved in figuring out what it is, but it's not just for them, right? Like, it's about healing the community, because the community is broken when there is violence.
Yes.
And so it's how does the community itself, which includes them, reconcile that and provide healing and provide that space. As we dive into the passage, in verse 3, we hear Isaiah talk about the ways that God has multiplied the nation. You have increased its joy. They rejoice before you. I was thinking about the different levels of joy that exist. Like, there's the joy of seeing someone I see every day and that relationship and that friendship. But there's a whole other level of joy, I think, when there's been a significant amount of time or when hardship has passed. So I think about, I just watched Home Alone and Home Alone 2 with the other night. And so thinking about like Kevin and his mom, Kate, after, right, they start out the movies and they are at each other's throats in many ways. And then there's this hardship that they both go through. And then when they're reunited, there is so much more joy at finding each other again and at reconnecting. And that, I think, is, I mean, right now as we're in a pandemic and so separated from people, I think about like the ways that we will be when we do get to see each other again, when we do get to hug each other and to just be together.
Yes. I think one of the issues that people are facing with the pandemic is that it's hard to plan for that. We want to plan for that, but we don't know when it's going to happen or what the circumstances will be, so we're kind of hamstringed when it comes to planning for that. And so we are looking forward to that joyful time, but we can't, set the menu yet, and that's kind of irritating. Or maybe that's just the Midwesterners, I'm not sure. When we reach verse 4, we hear, "For the yoke of their burden and the bar across their shoulders, the rod of the oppressor, you have broken as on the day of Midian." And this makes me think of the gang from Avatar: The Last Airbender. They did this for many small villages and towns, and even a couple of large cities, mostly across the Earth Kingdom, but really wherever they traveled. But I also was especially reminded of Prince Zuko on his lonely journey during the episode Zuko Alone, doing this for just one family and freeing them from a local bully. And there are many different ways that these things can be accomplished, and whether or not you're going to be thanked for them isn't really why you do it.
Yes. In verse 6, we hear about a child who is named, and in the English translation we have Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. And this is a little bit off from the actual how the Hebrew lines up, because Hebrew's punctuation is, not, and certainly not the way that English's punctuation is. But one of the things that this does do a good job of conveying is the ways that titles convey meaning and authority. Thinking about a child who will live into the title Wonderful Counselor or Prince of Peace. And I was thinking about in Grey's Anatomy, aka Call the Chaplain, when Dr. Burke and Dr. Shepard at the beginning only ever refer to each other as Dr. Last Name, because they don't have the level of respect and friendship to refer to each other as a first name basis, which is actually in many ways the opposite of what happens for, I think, for you and I, Kay, but for a lot of people who are professors or pastors or doctors who are also in some capacity hold minoritized identities and marginalized identities, where we are Pastor Emily and Pastor Kay because we have, in our culture and in our church, there is a history of not recognizing us as valid pastors.
And current day, for that.
Yeah. Yep. In some ways, right, for Grey's Anatomy, two men who are doctors, it's the opposite kind of what you and I experience and what other people experience of using the title pastor, using the title doctor is about respect and authority for the person and for that particular role. And so calling this child that is to be born Wonderful Counselor or Mighty God or Prince of Peace are about conveying respect and conveying a role to that.
That actually makes me think of a Star Trek reference. In Star Trek: The Next Generation, there is some personality clash, you might say, between a temporary character, Dr. Pulaski, and Counselor Troy, who is the counselor of the ship. And Dr. Pulaski kind of takes Troy to task because she's adopted some unusual practices of not wearing her uniform for her appointments with crew members in order to try to have a more personal and less rank-identified relationship with them. But that also translates to her not wearing her uniform while, doing her job in other parts of the ship, and that has created some confusion with other groups that they work with about whether or not she's actually a member of Starfleet. She doesn't claim her rank or her title in the same way that a lot of other people on the ship do, and Dr. Pulaski encourages her, and I might be remembering this wrong because I haven't seen these episodes for maybe 10 years now, but Dr. Pulaski insists on being Dr. Pulaski the entire time she's on board ship, because she's only there for like a year while Dr. Beverly Crusher is away doing other stuff. She doesn't have time to form those personal relationships that allows for that kind of informality. And so she and Counselor Troy clash quite a bit. But it's a really interesting study on how do women in a still misogynistic, I mean, the Next Generation was filmed in the 80s and early 90s, a still misogynistic community, how do they relate to each other?
Part of it, I think, for us today is, are they using their roles and their interactions to build each other up or to cut each other down because there's a scarcity model, right? Like, is it, I'm going to do my best and work my way and take advantage of what I can take advantage of in order to open the space for more people, or am I going to knock everybody off the ladder on my way up?
Yeah. There's also the issue of, the Star Trek writers at that time were perfectly happy to talk to actual real-life doctors about how do we talk about these medical things on the show that, might sound at least vaguely reasonable to a doctor now. Like, let's not make ourselves look like idiots. But as I understand it, they totally did not do that with psychologists or counselors. And so Counselor Troy winds up coming off very weirdly because they were not experts at what she actually would have been doing or what kind of professional practices she would have had in order to make her look reasonable. And because of that and a lot of weirdness about her character in other ways, her character wound up getting tied in giant knots about stuff like that. It was... The actress did everything she could with what she had, but her role is still very controversial in the show.
That reminds me of the Christmas movie that just came out this year on Netflix that's a New York Christmas Wedding. It's one of like 2 queer Christmas movies that are out, and they definitely did not consult with clergy. I mean...
Oh, no, of course not.
Catholic or otherwise. Like, it takes place a lot in a Catholic church, a lot of it, not all of it, but like there's a good chunk that's Catholic. They didn't consult with anyone Catholic, for sure, any Catholic clergy or like church people, but they didn't even like Protestant clergy. Like, I could have told you the things because I have enough ties to Catholicism.
Was the church decorated in the wrong colors?
No, but the reading that they read on Christmas Eve was definitely not an assigned reading.
Okay.
They didn't consult with LGBTQ people with a history of religious trauma because there's a thing that the priest does that's like...
Yikes.
Like, it ends up well in that context, but like...
Wait, you mean there's a Christmas movie with a happy ending? I'm confused.
Fair point. You should still all watch it because we need some actually like really good Christmas movies, but it's like a B level Christmas movie. So watch it and be prepared to laugh at it. But I think it's important.
Sometimes those are the most fun.
Right. It was fun to watch.
If only there was a Santa Claus arguing with Martians in the movie as well in the background, perhaps. Then it could be the true epic of B-movie possibilities.
That would be hilarious. That is not part of the B-movie that this is. But I do think it's important to watch the queer movies so that they make more, so that maybe they'll actually like have not low-budget queer Christmas movies, but like higher budget queer Christmas movies.
It would also be nice if it was easier to offer feedback to the who make these movies about, clergy exist in the real world, and if you approached us with a little bit of professionalism and general reasonableness, we would probably be willing to consult for you and make sure that you don't look like a giant.
Mm-hmm. And we've been taken advantage of enough by the church that we might even do it for free.
Yeah.
We shouldn't. We should get paid for it, but we might do it for free.
Or, like, stuff that you don't mind, like if you wanted to send us baked goods. Like, I'm not, hinting, because you guys don't totally have our mailing address.
I mean, I would rather have the money at this stage in pandemic life, but...
Oh, no, I would rather have the money, too. But, like, if it weren't a pandemic and you were to offer us, meeting a famous person instead, yeah, okay, we might take that.
But we shouldn't. We should take the money.
We should.
And meeting the famous person.
Yes. And possibly baked goods. Well,
yes, all of the things.
Yes.
Share the baked goods with the famous person and get paid.
Yes.
Brilliant.
When we reach verse 7, we hear, "His authority shall grow continually, and there shall be endless peace." Now, if this verse was not about the Messiah, and about one who was specifically sent by God, it would sound awfully threatening, wouldn't it? It makes me think of the Matrix movies and the machines learning how to keep humans busy in a digital world in order to use them for their body heat as an energy farm, essentially. Speaking of continually growing authority and endless peace, not the good kind of peace.
And keeping people busy in the digital world.
Well, I mean, we're keeping people busy in a digital world by making a podcast, but we are encouraging them to act with Christian kindness and generosity.
True. Good call. Our second reading for this episode is from Titus chapter 2, verses 11 through 14. God invites us into a life characterized by the hope we have in Jesus Christ, instead of by worldly urges. So one of the themes in this passage and towards the end of Isaiah is zeal. There is this zeal that Titus talks about, that Isaiah talks about. And I think really zeal is pretty foundational for what it means to be a nerd.
Yes.
Right? That's at the heart of being a nerd, is you have zeal about something. For me, when I was a kid, I had zeal for math because I loved math. And then there was a time where it was boring and I didn't love it. And then there was a time where I loved it again. And now I have zeal for random things like outer space or candy corn or, random things.
Or queer Christmas movies.
Queer Christmas movies. I have lots of zeal for queer Christmas movies and for queer things in general. What do you have zeal for?
Actually, I was just thinking that part of my problem is that I have been suffering from a lack of zeal, not just during the pandemic, but for the past couple years while trying to figure out my ADHD medications. I used to have zeal for reading. I could read a book in a car ride, let alone in an afternoon. I was famous for it. I was such a fast reader, and I would get so into it and so focused for a while. Hyperfocus is an ADHD thing. And I can't do that the same way right now, in part because of the medication I'm taking, which has other wonderful effects that allow me to function in the world, but it makes it more and more difficult to read longer pieces, like books. And so that's been a real struggle for me for the last couple of years, so I'm hoping to try different medications instead. But that's part of vagaries of life, that sometimes your zeal is not entirely under your own control. Sometimes your mental conditions and medications will have an effect on it, whether you like it or not.
Yeah. And sometimes the pandemic will.
Yes.
As we dive into the passage in verse 12, we hear about the grace of God that is training us to renounce impiety and worldly passions, and in the present age to live lives that are self-controlled, upright, and godly. And this sounds a lot like the training for the abnegation faction in Divergent. Abnegation being to deny yourself, right? So
it sounds like abdication, which is kind of a similar thought.
Yeah, but that particular faction is all about simplicity and not about passion, not about excitement. It's very we do good for everybody else and self-control.
Minimalism/Jedi?
Minimalism, less Jedi, because, Jedis fight. They just, serve.
Vulcan, sort of. The Vulcans can fight, but they usually don't.
Sure. I don't know that anyone from Abnegation that's really from Abnegation thinks that they could fight. But maybe. There are a couple.
This verse also reminds me of the many monastic orders that have taken this verse and ones like it as a guide for life. And these orders I've always thought of as actually a type of nerdery of their own. These lives are portrayed in, for example, the Codfell books by Edith Pargeter, which are good fun, or the TV series that stars Sir Derek Jacobi as Codfell, or in a less idealized way, perhaps, in the novel The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco, which, if you are a language nerd, that book is for you.
Ooh.
And
Sister Act?
Yes, I suppose you could also go with Sister Act or The Sound of Music. There's a movie from the 60s called The Trouble with Angels that I discovered a few years back that is impressively heartwarming for being a story of a teenage girl going to a Catholic school. And actually, so many movies about religion, as we have discussed before, are so incredibly inaccurate, despite the fact that many of us would be perfectly happy to be consultants. But they got a lot of stuff right. I am not an expert on Catholicism, so I can't speak to that part. They really got the general feel of things right.
Nice. In verse 13, we hear, "While we wait for the blessed hope and the manifestation of the glory of our great God and Savior, Jesus Christ." And particularly given that this is Christmas Eve, right? The manifestation of the glory of our great God is in the small. It's in a baby born to a woman. And so I couldn't help but think of Harry Potter's first defeat of Voldemort, right? Nobody expects it from a baby. Nobody expects anything from a baby. And then it is, in fact, the smallest little 1-year-old, 1+-year-old, who puts an end to this never-ending war. And I think that's part of the intentionality of how God chooses to come to us, that God doesn't choose to come with thunder and lightning and powerful things, but to say, all right, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this full tilt, and I'm going to come as a little baby, helpless, and you have to take care of me. And that is, in fact, I think, part of how we, as humans, like when we do care for babies, whether they're our own or a friend's, or when
a baby we're getting
paid for, right? But like that care for the young and the vulnerable is part of God's call for us.
Yes.
That's part of God's call. And when it's like not even just in physical form, right? But that's part of God's call for our communities, is to care for the young ones and the vulnerable ones.
Yes. You might even say that that kind of victory through a baby would only be less expected if it was the Spanish Inquisition. Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition.
That has to be a reference to something, and I have
Monty
no idea.
Python. You are completely unfamiliar with Monty Python, and all of my jokes just keep dying.
I mean, I am familiar with some Monty Python, but
yes,
Spanish Inquisition.
Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition has actually mutated into a meme,
of course,
because Monty Python lives on in so many different ways.
Sure.
But anytime somebody says nobody expects blank, I always insert the Spanish Inquisition in my head.
Of course you do.
So now I had a wonderful mental image of babies dressed in little cardinal robes.
Oh my God.
In verse 14, we hear that God will purify for himself a people of his own who are zealous for good deeds. This is another example of stuff that God can do because God is God, but really humans should not go this direction. Like, anytime humans go this direction, bad things happen. It always seems to wind up twisted by power somehow. There are a number of science fiction and fantasy stories about this, but the first one that came to mind for me was the Firefly movie Serenity, in which we find out what happened when the government tried to make people quote-unquote better, by which they meant calmer and more biddable, on the planet Miranda. Hint, it did not go well.
Not at all.
Trying to improve yourself and encourage others to improve themselves is one thing. Trying to alter a species wholesale in a vastly, shall we say, dumbed down way, just a unnuanced way, that generally does not end well for anybody. Our gospel reading for Christmas Eve is from Luke chapter 2, verses 1 through 14, possibly also including verses 15 through 20. Mary and Joseph go to Bethlehem to participate in the census, and Jesus is born there. Angels appear to shepherds in the hills to announce the birth of the Messiah.
So one of the themes in this passage is registration or tracking, right? So we hear that there is a census and that everybody has to be counted, which, as I learned in seminary, only happens for wars and taxes. But I was thinking about the different ways that people are registered or tracked. And in the Hunger Games, there's so many different ways that happens. There are required attendance events for all of the districts. And so they're all counted at the reaping and at different points and events in their district life. But then also in the game, all of the participants are injected with a tracker so that they can always be found during the actual Hunger Games. They can always be found by the people controlling all of the things. Or even, spoilers, in District 13, in the morning, everybody gets a temporary tattoo that lasts for like 12 hours with their schedule and all of that stuff. So they're all like, no matter what in each of these steps, they're all being tracked and counted. And it's a creepy thing and not a great thing. It's usually a sign of danger, I think, when everybody has to be tracked and counted. Except that it's also important, but there's just a lot of space for corruption in it.
On the one hand, it can be used responsibly and helpful ways. On the other hand, the thing about giving people power over other people is that power corrupts.
Yep.
On the other hand, we all definitely have driver's licenses.
I mean, not everybody has driver's licenses. I think more people could have driver's licenses if they didn't require particular things in order to get them.
And, and some people don't want driver's licenses, and that's fine too.
Mm-hmm.
In verse 1, we hear, "In those days a decree went out from Emperor Augustus that all the world should be registered." Now, I don't remember exactly all the details, but there are at least 2 historically inaccurate details in this verse. I'm pretty sure this is not the right emperor for that time, and also we have no evidence of a census being done around the time of Jesus' birth,
What?
which, by the way, would not have been the year 0. We actually miscounted because math is hard, and or because Christians are not good at math, as evidenced by the 1 + 1 + 1 = 1 attempt of the Trinity. Or, for that matter, go ahead and try to count the 3 days of Good Friday to Easter Sunday.
Seriously, I always think about that. It's so ridiculous. Okay.
Yeah, I just like to say that Christians are bad at math and just sum it up that way. But we've heard these verses. We've heard all of these verses Christians have for so long. They've become a part of the story anyway, right? The stories that we tell ourselves can become our history and part of who we see ourselves as emotionally, even when they're inaccurate, no matter how inaccurate they are. Which makes me think of the episode Neri from Star Trek The Original Series, which is actually a deeply creepy episode for other reasons that I won't go into because it still freaks me out. But the history of a planet, as told by its inhabitants, turns out to be wildly different than the history as discovered by other, shall we say, more professional historical methods. Because the story that they've been telling themselves has been slowly changed just a little bit every year. Because of that, they're telling themselves an entirely different story than what actually happened. We do that too. That's
whitewashing of history.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes it's for a purpose. Sometimes it's protecting somebody's power or bowdlerizing history or
whatting history?
Bowdlerizing history is removing all the icky bits, the bad words, and the stuff that, you're not supposed to talk about around children. I love that word. And we don't actually talk about it nearly often enough. But
because we just do it.
Like, for example, the actual version of the Shakespeare plays versus the versions that get performed. So many of the jokes are taken out.
I was thinking about...
Shakespeare had a sense of humor very similar to a teenager these days.
I was thinking about Mark Twain when they changed... I think they changed the N-word to slaves or something like that just...
Oh, goodness, for Huckleberry Finn. So there's a few different ways that things can be bowdlerized, but you're making something more palatable, I guess.
The hard part, though, is that what happens, particularly in our country most of the time, is that then the history that's told is a history that maintains the power and privilege and goodness of white people at the expense of people of color, especially Black and Indigenous people.
So sometimes it's intentional and crafted and planned. And also sometimes it's just people remember details wrong, or people, like something else better, or, there are huge parts of my grandmother's life on one side. We have no idea what her life was actually like. She had stories. She told us stories. We have looked up enough things to know that those stories had nothing to do with what was actually going on in the world at the time. Actual history versus the history we tell ourselves can be entirely different.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of actual history versus the history we tell ourselves, in verse 4, we hear that Joseph and Mary go to the city of David called Bethlehem because he was descended, Joseph that is, was descended from the house and family of David. And Bethlehem, is the house of bread. So it got me wondering if there was pressure for Joseph to bake and to know how to bake bread. And I'm
Or at least the women of his family, depending on gender roles.
Hey now. I'm currently doing some adventures. So I take a picture every day with different pieces of my nativity scenes as they're like getting ready for Christmas, and then we'll do it through Epiphany so that the Magi actually like get to be pretty visible and have some adventures. Part of what I had happen was that Joseph was helping me. We were making palmier, so pastries, but it was like the pressure that like, because he's from the house of bread, he has to be able to like bake. But I also was thinking of like in the Great British Baking Show, the pressure to do really well and represent your own town or country well, right? Like the people who are from Wales have like these particular things, or if they're doing like a particular type of shortbread that's from this one area and someone's from that area, they're like all the pressure to do it well and to like represent well. So I wonder about Joseph's pressure that he felt in baking. He certainly feels it in the adventures that I do.
I hope for this year, since we're in a pandemic and Christmas will be different, perhaps this year we can enjoy baking the things that we like instead of the things that are expected or that we feel we have to do in order to represent well. My grandmother died last Christmas Eve. And we loved her dearly, and she had a wonderful long life. And she cooked many things well and baked many things well. And none of us will miss her obsession with herring. Her baked goods were fabulous. But, enjoy the things you actually enjoy instead of having the things that you feel like you have to have because it's Christmas.
Ooh, herring. In verse 7, we hear that Mary gave birth to her firstborn son and wrapped him in bands of cloth and laid him in a manger because there was no place for them in the inn. And this passage is actually a beautiful example of hospitality. It isn't that everybody said no, it's that everybody was in town, and so all of the like extra rooms that are usually available weren't available, and so this would be kind of like a hobbit welcoming you to stay with them in their home because the prancing pony was full. The extra room is taken, so we're all going to stay together in the middle. And so this, like, laying Jesus in a manger is laying him in the midst of this whole community, which includes, the animals and stuff, but it includes the whole community surrounding and caring for him. Mary was probably not alone when she gave birth.
Verse 10 begins with, "But the angel said to them." And if anyone else hears the words that follow that, in the voice of Linus from A Charlie Brown Christmas, you are not alone. Every year, in my head, as I read that verse or as it is read to me, I always hear it in my head as in Linus's voice. And I love the Charlie Brown Christmas special for so many reasons, but one of them is that this is the only time we ever see Linus drop his beloved security blanket, not only in the Christmas special, but even throughout the comic strip of Peanuts or any of the other holiday specials. The only time we ever see him drop his beloved security blanket is when he tells the story of Christmas.
Aww, that's beautiful. Also a PSA, these angels are not like the weeping angels in Doctor Who.
Correct.
Just in case you were curious.
I mean, I haven't actually met one, and they definitely seem to freak people out. But other than that, they are not like the weeping angels of Doctor
Who. They have lots more eyes, and they're probably not going to kill you.
They might look like giant wheels.
There you go. Wheels with eyes. Thanks for joining us. Catch us next time when we'll discuss nerdery connections to the scripture readings for the first Sunday of Christmas. This podcast has been produced by us, Emily Ewing and Kay Rohloff. For more fun, check us out on Twitter and Facebook at NerdsAtChurch, NerdsAtChurch, or contact us at nerdsatchurch@gmail.com.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on Spotify, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. If you appreciate what we do or you want to get actual transcripts of the podcast episodes, consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/NerdsAtChurch. We hope Patreon can help us get our episodes transcribed for those who need or prefer that. Though if you want to help us with transcripts, let us know via email or social media. As the ancient Christians said,
Pax vobiscum.